Now, the other side has criticized those of us on our side for not going to a budget markup. The reason we have not is this is not the typical year in which the Republicans put up a budget resolution in the body they control. We put up a budget resolution. You go to conference committee to work out the differences. Something very different is occurring this year. There is a leadership negotiation with the highest leaders of the Republican Party in the House and the Senate, the highest leaders of the Democratic Party in the House and the Senate, meeting with the Vice President of the United States on a plan to put in place a 10-year effort or perhaps a 5-year plan to deal with the deficit and debt. In fact, the Republican leader has made this observation: the discussions that can lead to a result between now and August are the talks being led by Vice President Biden. That's a process that could lead to a result, a measurable result in the short term. And in that meeting is the only Democrat who can sign a bill into law. In fact, the only American out of 307 million of us who can sign a bill into law. He is in those discussions. That will lead to a result. Mr. President, it makes no sense for us to go to a budget markup at this moment that would simply be a partisan markup when bipartisan efforts are underway. Mr. President, last year for 8 months, I participated in the President's Fiscal Commission, 10 Democrats, 8 Republicans. At the end of that emerged the only bipartisan plan that's come from anywhere so far. 5 Democrats supported it, 5 Republicans supported it, 1 independent. 11 of the 18 commissioners voted for that plan to get our deficits and debt under control. We have underway this new effort, a leadership effort, with the President represented at the table. We ought to give that a chance before we pass a budget resolution that may be required to implement any plan that they can come up with. Now, Mr. President, the hard reality of what we confront is simply this. This shows the spending and revenues of the United States going back to 1950. More than 60 years of the revenue and expenditure history of the United States. The red line is the spending line. The green line is the revenue line. And Mr. President, what jumps out at you is spending as a share of our national income is the highest it has been in 60 years. On the other hand, revenue is the lowest it has been in 60 years as a share of national income. So, Mr. President, that's the reason we have record deficits. I hear all the time on the other side of the aisle, it's a spending problem. Mr. President, when you have a deficit, that is the result of the difference between revenue and spending. We have a spending problem, yes, indeed. Highest spending as a share of national income in 60 years. We also have a revenue problem. The lowest revenue we have had as a share of national income in 60 years. And so now the House has sent us a plan, a Republican budget plan, and the first thing they do is cut the revenue some more. Revenue is the lowest it has been in 60 years, and the first thing they do to address a deficit is cut the revenue some more. In fact, they cut, over the next 10 years, another more than $4 trillion in revenue. For those who are the wealthiest among us, they give them an additional $1 trillion in tax reductions by extending the top rate cuts, by extending a $5 million estate tax exemption, by cutting the top rate down to 25% from the 35% it is today. They are giving massive new tax cuts to the wealthiest among us. Mr. President, their average revenue during the 10 years of their plan is 18.3%. You can see the last 5 times the budget has been balanced here, revenues have been around 20%, 19.7, 19.9, 19.8, 20.6, 19.5. the revenue plan that they have would never have balanced the budget in the last 30 years. Mr. President, if we look at what's happened on the revenue side of the equation, here's what's happened to the effective tax rate for the 400 wealthiest taxpayers in the United States. Since 1995, when the effective tax rate on the wealthiest 400 was about 30%, that effective rate today is 16.6%. Warren Buffett has said that his executive assistant pays a higher tax rate than he does. Well, how can that be? Well, the reason that happens is because Mr. Buffett has most of his income from dividends and capital gains taxed at a rate of 15%. His executive assistant is probably taxed at a rate somewhere in the 20 or 25% rate. So, Mr. President, we have a circumstance in which we got the lowest revenue in 60 years. The House Republicans have sent us a budget that says, let's cut it some more. Let's cut it another $4 trillion, and let's give $1 trillion of that to the wealthiest among us. Mr. President, if you look at what our friends are proposing, when we have the largest deficit since World War II, they are proposing to give those who earn over $1 million a year a tax cut on average in 2013 of almost $200,000. For those earning over $10 million, they would give them on average a tax cut of $1,450,000. This at a time we have record deficits. What sense does this make? It makes no sense. And so, what are they doing to offset these massive new tax cuts for the wealthiest among us? They've decided the answer is to shred the social safety net that has been created in this country over the last 60 years. They have decided to shred Medicare. Shred it. They have decided to shred program after program so that they can give more tax cuts to those who are the wealthiest among us. Mr. President, here is what a top former President Reagan advisor said when he looked at the House budget proposal. Remember, this is not a Democrat. This is a top former Reagan economic advisor. This is what he said. His name is Bruce Bartlett. He said in his blog about the proposal from the House Republicans on the budget, distributionally, the Ryan plan is a monstrosity. The rich would receive huge tax cuts while the social safety net would be shredded to pay for them. Even as an opening bid to begin budget negotiations with the Democrats, the Ryan plan cannot be taken seriously. It is less of a wish list than a fairy tale, utterly disconnected from the real world, backed up by make-believe numbers and unreasonable assumptions. Ryan's plan isn't even an act of courage, it's just pandering to the Tea Party. A real act of courage would have been for him to admit, as all serious budget analysts know, that revenues will have to rise well above 19% of GDP to stabilize the debt. Mr. President, let's just go back to that chart that makes the point that Mr. Bartlett is making, that the 5 times the budget has been balanced around here in the last 30 years, last 40 years, 1969, 1998, 1999, 2000, 2001. By the way, those last 4 all during the Clinton administration. You can see what the revenue has been, nearly 20% of GDP in every one of those years. Revenue today is 14.5% of GDP. It's no wonder we've got a problem with deficits. You combine the high spending that we have now with the low revenue, you have record deficits. And Mr. President, because our friends on the other side have decided that the first thing you do when you have record deficits and the lowest revenue in 60 years, they've decided the first thing you do is go out and give more tax breaks to the wealthiest among us. Here's what they have to do to health care in the United States. Number 1, end Medicare as we know it. Replace it with a voucher system. They would reopen the prescription drug donut hole that means seniors have to pay more of their prescription drug costs. They would block grant Medicaid that ends the counter-cyclical nature of the program. They would defund health reform, increasing the number of uninsured by 34 million people. 34 million more Americans would not have health insurance if the plan that is before us would pass. Mr. President, when I say they are ending Medicare as we know it, here's why I say that. Right now, traditional Medicare, the individual pays about 25% of the cost. The rest is paid by Medicare. But look what the House Republican plan would do. It would dramatically increase the health care spending by seniors. Instead of paying 25% of the bill, seniors would be expected to pay 68% of their health care costs. That is what the Republican plan is about. Very generous additional tax breaks to the wealthiest among us. For those earning more than $10 million a year, they would give on average $1,450,000 tax reduction. And to make up for it, they would say to seniors, instead of paying 25% of your health care costs under Medicare, you pay 68%. What would that mean in dollar terms? Well, Mr. President, seniors would go from paying $6,150 a year to $12,500 a year. That is the Republican plan that is before us. That is the budget plan that we are going to vote on later this evening. Mr. President, anybody that can't see, that is a shredding of Medicare. That is a shredding of the social safety net. Just isn't looking very closely. And Mr. President, the former Republican Speaker called the House Republican Medicare proposal right-wing social engineering. Those are not my words. Those are his words. Here's the interview. On Meet the Press on May 15th, Mr. Gregory, the host, asked this: do you think the Republicans ought to buck the public opposition and really move forward to completely change Medicare, turn it into a voucher program? Mr. Gingrich's answer: I don't think right-wing social engineering is any more desirable than left-wing social engineering. I don't think imposing radical change from the right or the left is a very good way for a free society to operate. Mr. President, this budget that is before us is not just radical with respect to what it does to Medicare, what it does to the revenue of the United States. You look at every part of this budget. There are no savings in defense after we have had this massive defense buildup. From 1997 to 2011, you can see spending on defense has gone from $254 billion a year to $688 billion a year. Now, even the House Budget Committee Chairman, Mr. Ryan, who is the architect of this plan, has said, quote, there are a lot of savings you can get in defense. There's a lot of waste over there for sure. That's what he said about defense spending. Here's what he did about it. He increased it dramatically. From $529 billion, this is just the underlying defense budget, this doesn't count the war funding, he increases the regular defense budget from $529 billion in 2011 to $667 billion by 2021. He did not cut one thin dime. After saying there's lots of waste there, lots of places for savings, after the Secretary of Defense himself has said they've got to restrain spending, after the Secretary of Defense himself has proposed $178 billion of savings, the budget before us doesn't save one dime out of defense, instead increases it dramatically, from $529 billion to $667 billion, and that does not count war funding. War funding would be on top of it. Mr. President, this budget before us, the Republican budget from the House, also takes some of the fundamentals of making our country strong and cuts them dramatically. Education is number one. I was raised by my grandparents. My grandmother was a school teacher. She used to say in our household there are three priorities. Number one is education. Number two is education. Number three is education. And we got the message. Let me just read what two of the country's foremost economists have said about the importance of education to the U.S. economy. An educated population is a key source of economic growth. Broad access to education was, by and large, a major factor in the United States' economic dominance in the 20th century and in the creation of a broad middle class. Indeed, the American dream of upward mobility, both within and across generations, has been tied to access to education. So what does the budget before us that's come over from the Republican House do? Well, it cuts education 15%, from $91 billion to $77 billion from 2011 to 2012. Education, obviously, is not the only important pillar to our economy. Another important pillar is the infrastructure of the country, our roads, bridges, highway, airports. These are the things that support a vibrant and strong U.S. economy. Here is the engineer's report card on America's infrastructure. Aviation, a D. Bridges, a C. Rail, a C-. Roads, D-. Transit, a D. The infrastructure gross point average, a D. So what do our colleagues propose in the budget that is before us? Well, they propose cutting it 30%. Can you imagine what it's going to be like to try to get around this country if you go out and cut transportation 30%? Anybody who's driven on any of the roads across America, certainly the roads in any of the major cities, anybody who's gone through any of the airports, anybody who's gone on a rail system in this country, you think we're going to be better off if we cut the funding 30%? Well, that's exactly what the Republican budget that is before us proposes. Mr. President, we also know one of the near-term threats to the economy, what's happening to the price of gasoline. Since December of 2008, gasoline has gone from $1.81 a gallon to $3.85 on May 23rd, up $2 a gallon. Every economist has said this is hurting the economic recovery in this country. Mr. President, what do our colleagues in the House send us as a budget for energy? Things that can be done to reduce our dependence on foreign energy? They cut it 57%. 57% cut in the strategies designed to reduce our dependence on foreign energy, cut it 57%. Mr. President, it doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. It is not in the mainstream of thinking. This is a budget that if you poll the constituent elements to the American people, they reject it out of hand. They do not believe Medicare should be shredded. They do not believe that those who are the most fortunate among us ought to be given more tax reductions at this time. With record deficits and a debt growing out of control, the first thing to be done is not to say to those earning over $1 million a year, you get a $200,000 tax cut. To those earning over $10 million a year, you get a tax reduction of $1,450,000. And then to turn around and slash many of the things that help middle-class families in this country, whether it's education or infrastructure or transportation. That is the budget that is before us from our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Mr. President, we have other budget plans, the Paul budget plan, the Toomey budget plan. I'll comment on those later. But I hope very much that colleagues are listening, that they pay close attention to this debate, that they have a chance to evaluate what should be the position of this chamber when we vote later this evening. Mr. President, I believe this is a defining vote for this chamber. Are we going to approve a budget that is truly radical in its scope and dimension, that fundamentally ends Medicare as we know it, and at the same time gives massive new tax cuts to the wealthiest among us? I would say at a time when we are having the lowest revenue in 60 years, that cutting the revenue of the United States by over $1 trillion to give additional tax reductions to those who have already enjoyed dramatic tax reductions. I pointed out early in my presentation, the effective tax rate on those who are the wealthiest among us has declined dramatically during the recent years. This proposal from the House of Representatives said we'll do even more to reduce the tax load on those who are the wealthiest among us. Mr. President, I don't think it adds up. Let me just say to those who think, well, at least the Ryan budget, the Republican budget, will reduce our deficits and get our debt back on track, will solve that problem. Let me just leave you with one number. The Republican budget from the House of Representatives that we will vote on later today increases the gross debt of the United States by $8 trillion. So anybody that thinks that shredding Medicare and giving these giant tax breaks to the wealthiest among us is going to solve the problem, that's going to stop the explosion of debt, is just wrong. In the budget before us, the Republican budget from the House of Representatives, the gross debt of the United States in the next 10 years is increased by $8 trillion. For those who think the debt is already too high, you want to vote for a plan that is going to increase the debt, the gross debt of the United States, another $8 trillion? Well, that's the Republican plan from the House of Representatives. That's the budget that's before us. That is the budget we are going to vote on later this evening.